Sexual energy, in its essence, is not confined to the physical act of sex, nor is it restricted to romantic longing or fleeting desire. It is a primordial psychic force, an energy seated deep within the human unconscious that precedes language, culture, and even the sense of self. It is one of the rawest and most fundamental expressions of the life instinct, what some traditions call libido, not in the narrow Freudian sense of mere eroticism, but in the broader sense of a creative life force. This energy, when viewed symbolically, is the fire of transformation, the seed of becoming, and the inner wellspring of creativity, vitality, and personal magnetism. To understand its significance, one must look not merely at its biological function, but at its archetypal meaning. Across cultures and myths, sexual energy is always associated with power, fertility, divine union, or even destruction, a dual-natured force. The serpent coiled at the base of the spine, the kundalini of Eastern traditions, is one such symbol, a dormant force that, when awakened, rises upward through the body, igniting centers of perception, insight, and expanded consciousness. This is not metaphor. It is psychological truth, clothed in symbolic language. When we experience sexual attraction or arousal, we are not simply reacting to an external stimulus. We are coming into contact with an ancient energy that predates the ego. It is the stirring of something far older than the individual, something collective, archetypal, and full of potential. At such moments, the psyche is reminding us of its capacity for generation and transformation. Whether this energy becomes compulsive, repressive, or creative depends entirely on how the conscious mind relates to it. Modern culture, obsessed with surface-level gratification and image, often confines sexual energy to pleasure-seeking, distraction, or consumerism. The market sells sexuality back to the individual in fragmented, commodified pieces, detaching it from its source and reducing it to a product. This reduction blinds many to its deeper truth. Sexual energy is a form of inner wealth, a reservoir of psychic vitality that can be used for far more than momentary release. When it is preserved, contemplated, and redirected, it begins to feed other dimensions of the self: intuition, ambition, courage, vision. This energy, then, is a currency of the soul. It circulates through dreams, fantasies, desires, longings, and even creative blocks. It hides behind the urge to build, to connect, to penetrate the surface of things and uncover deeper meaning. The artist who channels erotic longing into sculpture, the writer who pours it into prose, the philosopher who sublimates it into systems of thought, all are practicing a form of energetic alchemy. They are not denying the sexual urge. They are recontextualizing it, giving it form and meaning beyond the physical. The power of this energy also lies in its magnetic quality. A person who is inwardly aligned with their sexual vitality, without being ruled by it, exudes an inexplicable charisma. Others are drawn not necessarily to their appearance, but to their radiance, their life force made visible. This magnetism has little to do with seduction and everything to do with integrity. It is the radiance of someone who has met themselves at the most primal level and has not turned away. One who can hold that energy, not discharge it mindlessly, begins to accumulate a psychic charge, an inner tension that becomes both creative and influential. This accumulation is not repression. It is containment, not as in imprisonment, but as in the sacred containment of fire within a furnace or water behind a dam. The contained force does not weaken. It builds pressure, builds power, builds direction. And in this containment lies the foundation for transmutation, the process through which raw sexual energy becomes something more refined, more elevated, and ultimately more liberating. Sexual energy, like any elemental force, becomes either constructive or destructive depending on how it is engaged. Fire warms and cooks, but it also burns and devours. Water nourishes and cleanses, yet it can drown. Sexual energy is no different. It is profoundly ambivalent, capable of elevating the human soul or consuming it in cycles of addiction, compulsion, and shame. What determines its effect is not the energy itself, but the level of consciousness with which it is handled. In its most instinctual form, this energy seeks release, not purpose. When the psyche is immature, ruled by impulse, or haunted by unintegrated shadow, it discharges sexual energy in fragmented and compulsive ways. The modern world offers endless channels for such discharge. Hyperstimulation, pornography, meaningless encounters, and endless distraction masquerading as liberation. Yet, rather than fulfillment, what follows is often emptiness, fatigue, and a strange, quiet erosion of personal power. For you, what is happening is not merely moral decline or poor decision-making. It is a psychic hemorrhage. Vital force, the same that could be directed toward art, innovation, relationship, or vision, is being bled out through unconscious repetition. Sound. Each act of unconscious release dissipates not just energy, but will, focus, and the ability to hold inner tension. This tension is vital. It is the crucible in which transmutation occurs. Without it, the personality remains fragmented, scattered, unable to deepen. The cost of repeated dissipation is not just physical, it is symbolic. The individual becomes disconnected from their own generative potential, like a tree that can no longer root itself into the dark soil of instinct. Over time, this manifests as anxiety, fatigue, depression, or even nihilism, the soul signaling that its deeper reservoir is being neglected. To master sexual energy is not to repress it, but to engage it with awareness, to contain it so that it can grow in depth and complexity. Containment does not mean denial, it means choosing not to indulge the immediate urge for gratification in favor of inner growth, in favor of a higher purpose. It is the difference between spilling water on the ground and channeling it to turn a wheel. That wheel may grind wheat, generate electricity, or irrigate a barren field, but only if the current is preserved. True mastery begins with a recognition of value. One must come to see sexual energy not as a shameful or base instinct, but as sacred fuel, something to be guarded, like treasure. This treasure, when hoarded out of fear, stagnates and corrupts the psyche. But when honored, studied, and slowly directed, it becomes transformative. The individual begins to cultivate inner discipline, a strength of character that emerges not from suppression, but from the capacity to carry potent energy without being overrun by it. This capacity is rare in a world that teaches us to outsource desire, to chase validation, pleasure, and fleeting highs. Yet all of these external pursuits are poor substitutes for the internal alchemy of self-possession. When one no longer needs to discharge desire just to silence its discomfort, but can sit with it, breathe into it, and listen, something changes. The energy begins to speak. It reveals images, urges, insights, dreams. It takes on symbolic form. What was once pure instinct becomes psychic language, the vocabulary of transformation. Those who fail to master this energy are often ruled by it. They confuse freedom with indulgence, not realizing they are imprisoned by their own appetites. But mastery means choice, the ability to direct, delay, refine. It is the subtle art of psychic governance, knowing when to act, when to hold, when to transform. And as this mastery grows, so does the individual's power, not just over their instincts, but over their entire life trajectory. Transmutation is not the act of denying sexual energy, it is the process of refining it. Like raw ore drawn from deep within the earth, sexual energy begins as something primal, elemental, and often chaotic. Yet within that rawness lies latent gold, a force that, if elevated, can become intuition, creativity, spiritual perception, and inner authority. This is the essence of psychic alchemy, the movement of energy from the lower instincts of the body to the higher functions of the soul. At the root, sexual energy arises from the instinctual realm. It belongs to the biological matrix that governs survival, reproduction, and animal desire. But the human being is not merely animal. We carry within us the tension of dual inheritance, flesh and spirit, body and psyche, matter and symbol. This tension is not a flaw. It is the very arena of transformation. The same force that drives reproduction can become the drive to create a symphony, write a book, start a movement, or seek the divine. The direction of the energy is determined by conscious engagement, by a willingness to meet the instinct, not indulge it blindly, but to hear what it might become if given a higher path. Transmutation requires the courage to withhold premature expression. When sexual energy is immediately spent, it serves only its lowest form. But when it is held, contemplated, and ritually contained, it begins to accumulate pressure. Not as repression, but as a rising force seeking new outlets. This pressure is necessary. It is the inner heat that catalyzes the change from instinct into vision. One might feel restless, even tormented during this phase. Dreams intensify, desires swell, symbols emerge unbidden. These are signs that the unconscious is beginning to speak in its own language, offering alternatives to mere physical release. This process is not linear. It often begins with conflict. The rational mind resists the irrational pull of longing. But within that friction lies the spark of transformation. Instinct, when honored but not obeyed, begins to mutate. The same longing that once sought bodies may now seek truth, beauty, excellence, or communion with the unseen. One begins to channel that energy into learning, building, connecting, driven by something deeper than motivation, something like an inner fire. The body still feels it, but it is no longer trapped in the pelvis. It ascends through the chest, the throat, the eyes. It becomes a refined current that lights up the whole being. As the energy rises, so too does intuition, that quiet, knowing voice that arises not from thought, but from deep alignment. It is through this rising that instinct is transformed into inner guidance. What was once raw and pressing becomes subtle and illuminating. Decisions are no longer made from compulsion, but from resonance. Creativity flows, not from effort, but from connection with the source. One becomes a vessel for something higher, a conduit through which symbolic truth can manifest. This shift from instinct to intuition is rarely celebrated in modern life, which remains addicted to speed and instant gratification. But for those who learn the art of transmutation, life begins to take on a different texture. One becomes less reactive, more magnetic. Not because desire has vanished, but because it has taken root in deeper soil. It now feeds the entire psyche, nourishing not just the body, but the imagination, the intellect, and the spirit. Practices that support this transmutation are often quiet and inward. Solitude, stillness, focused work, disciplined creativity, intentional breath. These are not escapes from sexuality, but pathways through it, tools that allow energy to climb the vertical axis of being. The same energy that once begged for release becomes a current of insight, guiding the individual not toward escape, but toward full embodiment. Every human carries within them a hidden realm, a place where unacknowledged desires, fears, impulses, and wounds live in silence. This is the shadow, the psychic counterpart to the conscious self. Sexual energy, due to its potency and taboo in many societies, is one of the most common forces to be exiled into this shadowed domain. Yet, what is repressed does not vanish. It waits. It shapes our dreams, distorts our relationships, fuels addictions, and re-emerges in compulsions, fantasies, and projections. To transmute sexual energy, one must first be willing to descend into this inner underworld and meet what has been denied, disowned, or judged. The shadow is not evil. It is merely unknown. It contains all the parts of us that the ego, the conscious identity, could not accept. Sexual shame, forbidden desires, past traumas, unmet needs, even our sensual vitality itself. If any of these have been suppressed, they often sink into the unconscious, where they continue to exert influence from the dark. This is why many people find themselves acting out behaviors they consciously oppose or feeling torn between contradictory impulses. The energy of the shadow leaks out when it is ignored. True integration requires turning toward the shadow, not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a part of the self that longs to be understood and redeemed. When one begins to explore the inner world honestly, through dreams, fantasies, triggers, and emotional responses, they may begin to see that what they had labeled as unacceptable is in fact an expression of life force, albeit one seeking the wrong outlet. A sexual compulsion, for example, may mask a deeper longing for intimacy, connection, or creative expression. The darkness conceals not a demon, but a wounded God. Meeting the shadow is not an intellectual exercise. It is emotional, symbolic, and somatic. It may involve grieving lost parts of oneself, revisiting old wounds, or confronting cultural and familial conditioning that taught us to fear our own bodies. But within that confrontation lies immense liberation. What was once projected onto others, envy, desire, repulsion, can now be reclaimed and re-owned. The psychic energy once spent on repression or denial becomes available again, flowing back into the system like a recovered inheritance. As integration deepens, the relationship to sexual energy changes. It becomes less about control and more about communication. The body no longer feels like an adversary. Desire no longer feels dangerous. Instead, these forces are seen as inner messengers, each image, fantasy, or impulse pointing toward something that the psyche wants to explore, heal, or bring to life. The more of the shadow one integrates, the more whole one becomes, not perfect, but complete. And in this completeness, sexual energy becomes a conscious ally, not a chaotic threat. It is through integration that the individual begins to develop psychic integrity, the capacity to hold opposing forces within the self without being torn apart by them. One becomes less fragmented, less reactive. There is no longer a need to escape into indulgence or repression because nothing within the self is being exiled. The inner world becomes a coherent ecosystem where instinct, emotion, intellect, and spirit communicate fluidly. What emerges is a deeper form of maturity, one not defined by suppression, but by inner sovereignty. This sovereignty is not cold or detached. It is erotically alive, rooted in self-awareness, and rich with symbolic depth. The erotic, in this sense, is not limited to the sexual act. It is the quality of being in full contact with life, in all its pleasure and pain, light and dark. When one integrates the shadow, sexual energy is no longer fragmented or feared. It becomes unified with a total psyche, a current that flows not beneath the surface, but through the center of one's being, carrying within it the wisdom of every part once left in the dark. Transmuting sexual energy is not a one-time decision. It is a disciplined, rhythmic process rooted in ritual and intention. Without practice, insight dissipates. Without structure, inner power leaks. Transmutation requires not only the willingness to engage with deep inner forces, but also the development of containers, rituals, habits, and environments strong enough to hold the intensity of desire and direct it toward higher forms of expression. The body is the first vessel of this process. Breathwork, for instance, is not just a calming technique. It is a way to move energy consciously. Sexual energy tends to accumulate in the lower body, particularly the pelvic region. Through deep rhythmic breathing, this energy can be drawn upward, through the spine, into the heart, the throat, the mind. This movement mirrors the ascent of Kundalini in yogic traditions, or the rising of the philosopher's stone in alchemical symbolism. The breath becomes a bridge between instinct and awareness, between arousal and insight. Silence and solitude also play an essential role. In the noise of daily life, subtle inner movements are drowned out. When the individual retreats into solitude, not as escape but as sacred withdrawal, they create space for the psyche to speak. In that silence, unresolved desires begin to reveal their true shape. What initially appears as lust may, upon reflection, unveil a longing for connection, purpose, or self-expression. The withdrawal from external stimuli is not repression. It is a way to turn the gaze inward to become intimate with one's own psychic landscape. Both literal and symbolic is another powerful tool. Not merely the abstention from food, but from overstimulation, digital media, casual pleasure-seeking, unnecessary conversations. Each form of fasting creates a kind of psychic vacuum, which nature abhors. Into that vacuum, energy that would otherwise be scattered begins to gather. The discipline of not reaching for the habitual distraction allows one to feel the full intensity of inner fire. This can be uncomfortable. It can stir restlessness, frustration, even despair. Restlessness, frustration, even despair. But this is precisely the pressure that catalyzes transformation. In that heat, clarity forms. Another essential ritual is focused creative work. Sexual energy is creative energy. To transmute it, one must give it a new outlet, something that requires attention, patience, and soul. Writing, painting, composing, designing, building, teaching, whatever form the expression takes, it must ask something of the psyche. Not mere productivity, but engaged creation, where the energy invested returns as meaning and insight. In this space, the sexual impulse is not denied. It is reauthored, rewritten in a new symbolic language. Body movement, too, is a form of ritual. Whether through dance, martial arts, or disciplined physical training, movement becomes a way to circulate energy and release tension without collapsing into unconscious gratification. The body, when moved intentionally, becomes a living temple, a place where energy is honored and refined. Meditation and inner dialogue are equally vital. These are the spaces where the conscious self can meet the unconscious, not in conflict, but in conversation. Or visualization, journaling, and symbolic inner work allow the practitioner to track the flow of desire, to notice patterns, and to distinguish between urges that lead to elevation and those that spiral into compulsion. The more one listens, the more the psyche begins to reveal its codes. So dreams become clearer. Archetypes emerge. Desires become navigable. These practices are not merely techniques, they are initiatory acts. Each one deepens the relationship between the individual and their inner world. Each one is a rehearsal for sovereignty, the ability to hold, direct, and cultivate energy without becoming a servant to it. The ritual becomes the crucible, the practice becomes the path. In honoring the energy, but refusing to be ruled by it, the individual begins to shape their life, not through force, but through alignment with the deep current moving within them. Wealth is too often measured in external terms: currency, property, influence, accumulation. Yet beneath these visible forms lies a deeper, more essential kind of wealth, the inner sense of vitality, coherence, and energetic alignment. When sexual energy is transmuted, it becomes fuel for this inner wealth, a psychic abundance that shapes not only what we create, but how we move through the world. True wealth arises when the life force within flows without obstruction, guided not by impulse, but by purpose. In psychological terms, this alignment begins when the conscious ego no longer fights against the deeper instincts of the psyche, but enters into partnership with them. The individual ceases to live in fragments, no longer torn between lust and shame, desire and guilt, ambition and fear. They begin to harmonize these opposing forces into a singular, directed current. This is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of inner coherence. The psyche becomes unified, and in that unity, power returns. When sexual energy is no longer compulsively released or chronically repressed, it accumulates within the system as creative tension. This tension is not discomfort to be avoided. It is potential, compressed, and waiting. That potential, when linked to a clear intention or life path, becomes a force of manifestation. The individual begins to shape reality, not by effort alone, but by magnetism. What they desire moves toward them, not through manipulation, but because their inner state becomes resonant with the outcomes they seek. This is not magical thinking. It is energetic law. Like attracts like when the frequency is pure. Purpose is the crucible through which raw energy becomes refined. Without purpose, energy scatters. It seeks distraction, pleasure, or escape. But when the psyche is oriented toward a deep calling, something that transcends the ego's need for validation, the energy organizes itself around that aim. Focus sharpens, time distorts, work becomes a form of devotion. This is when one begins to feel the difference between being pushed by the world and being pulled by the soul. The latter is the hallmark of transmuted energy. It doesn't grind, it flows. This alignment also changes one's relationship with ambition. Instead of chasing wealth as an external goal, the individual realizes they are the generator of wealth. Their energy, when concentrated and expressed with integrity, becomes a resource more valuable than money. People respond to it. Opportunities open. Networks form. This is not manipulation or performance. It is the natural consequence of being deeply in tune with oneself. When the psyche is no longer leaking energy through inner conflict, self-doubt, or unintegrated desire, it radiates clarity. Others feel this clarity, even if they cannot name it. Sexual energy, once transmuted, becomes a form of charisma. Not superficial charm, but a gravitational presence. It is the felt sense that one is alive in their body, awake in their mind, and lit from within by a purpose greater than personal gain. This magnetism draws in not only people, but the right conditions, the right timing, the right resources. The outer world begins to mirror the inner alignment. What was once effortful becomes effortless. What once required willpower now moves with natural momentum. There is also a profound shift in value perception. The individual no longer measures success solely in external terms, but by the degree of inner fulfillment. They begin to ask different questions. Does my work nourish my soul? Is my creativity in service of something meaningful? Am I living in alignment with what I know to be true within me? These questions become the compass by which they navigate, and in doing so, they often find that material wealth follows, not as the aim, but as the echo of inner abundance. This is the paradox. The more one draws energy inward and upward, toward depth, vision, and purpose, the more the outer world responds. Wealth, then, is not pursued but embodied. It arises not from extraction, but from expression, not from scarcity, but from saturation, from being full, whole, and overflowing with the energy that was once scattered, but is now gathered, focused, and alive with meaning.